Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
And today we're going to be talking about the Meanie Crisis versus the Meaning Crisis. This was inspired by a techno-social discussion between Dr. Cadell Last, Alexander Bard, Daniel Frege, Owen Cox, where they were talking about the Meaning Crisis being dead, and that inspired a reflection called the Meanie Crisis.
Yeah, I just recorded this reflection on Anchor.
Yep,
so if you want to
Anchor.
go, you can go listen to the original there. I think it's like 7 minutes long or something.
7 minutes. there you
I'm
go.
wrapping Christmas presents, so it's... Oh, yeah, I don't
You-
know why I
you-
do
you
these
were
things.
You were double fisting life.
Yes, double fisting
Fisting
life. Exactly.
Yeah. Well done.
Thank you. So, the talk was great on Technosocial, so everyone should really go listen
Yeah,
to that.
it's a good channel.
And I was thinking about the talk and this topic of the meaning crisis being dead, and just generally the meaning crisis in general. And I was thinking about how we tend to find meaning in everything,
Sure.
and even to not find meaning in something is a type of meaning.
Can be a kind of meaning.
It can be a kind of meaning. And then I thought about how in relationships, because we do this thing of finding meanings, we actually unintentionally, we end up being very mean
Oh, yeah.
because we assume meanings about someone's actions or inaction.
Oh, yeah.
And so I just had that thought, and then I was like, that's fascinating. It has to do with this kind of interesting obsession with meaning, which maybe obsession is the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying.
Oh, sure,
This kind of
sure.
this
Tendency, natural,
tendency,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
This
Disposition.
propensity
Yeah.
towards meaning. And then I had that thought about how that would make sense then, because it has to be oriented in the right way though, because if it isn't, then meaning actually becomes something bad. It can, meaning can be good or bad. It's almost like what's your frame of reference, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, I was just thinking like, oh, that's funny. I wonder if that's why couples or people in relationships or even friends can have issues with each other and end up being very actually mean to one another because they assume a meaning, and in the talk I talk about a superstructure of meaning, right? Like a mega structure of meaning. The person doesn't do one thing, and it means this whole thing about their character or how much they love you or don't love you, and that's why I was like, that's interesting. So then I was like, the Meanie Crisis, and I just thought it was like a really hilarious term.
Yeah. Well, there's something about they forget to get the mail, and it can't simply be that they forgot to get the mail. It has to mean they're irresponsible.
Exactly, exactly.
They forgot to they forgot that you don't like the color red, and they got blue on the Valentine card, or they got red on the Valentine card.
Gosh darn you!
Red. It's so predictable at Valentine, and that means they don't listen to you. That means they never listen to you. There's this bigger meaning, and I think it's important what you're saying.
Yeah.
Sometimes we can assume meaning is good, but it actually, there is a number of situations where it's actually very important to not read into. We talk about reading into.
Yes.
But, the same function of reading from and reading into is the same action of giving meaning.
Exactly.
And we never... The problem is we easily can tell when other people are reading into.
Exactly.
But when we ourselves do it, we think it's gospel. We don't tend to notice. It's very similar to the idea that, everyone else interprets while we just read.
Right.
So,
Well, and that makes me think of that other, expression I probably talk with you about, where it's almost like, go read books, not people. It's if you read into people too much, you really should shift your focus on. I mean, yes, is it good to observe? Is it good to assess? Is it good to kind of collect information, if you will, about what a person likes or doesn't like, or what do they talk about a lot, things like that. That's great. That's good. This is called paying attention. But if you start to basically derive some sort of superstructure of meaning, macro meaning on that person, you will smother them. You will completely that completely obscures your ability to actually connect with the person.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You want to connect with the person, and you're probably finding that superstructure meaning because you feel it would be, I don't know, helpful, or you think like that's just what it is, like you're saying, is gospel truth. So it's like, well, we can't be, we got to be honest. Like, let's just be honest about the situation, when really it is a misinterpretation. But we always think the other person's misinterpreting.
Or it's an overextension.
Right. But what ends up happening is it just creates a really bad divide between the two people. Because, you know, if you think about it physically, it's like, here's your giant, you know, just giant macro meaning that you're holding up, like this like big large thing, this like you know, tablet, this is the way it is,
right?
And it's so set in stone because you're so sure about it. And what well, you can't even, like, if you're thinking about it like a large thin stone, these don't exist, tablet type of thing, then you cannot even see the person. You know, you cannot even see the person. You cannot even connect with the person. And I liked what you said when we were talking about this with each other, about how I think what we have to do is shift our, you know, you can if you don't find meaning in like something you're creating, something with a bigger vision, if you will, like something that's building towards something that's, you know, just on a higher level,
a project,
some goal, something that's just bigger than yourself, basically, something you're working toward. Then you just start to do that with people. Like you make people your projects. And now your macro meaning is not being found in this, you know, book, like, I don't know, volume of books you want to write.
Sure.
It's being constructed over the person. You're like, it's almost like you're building a sculpture, but you're like, you know, you're just kind of over there manipulating and like making the person what you think, because now you've made the person your macro meaning instead of finding a macro meaning in this like higher work. Okay,
well, it's you know, you have that idea in thermal, you know, that idea that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, right? It's almost like meaning can neither be created nor destroyed. Human beings are going to find meaning, and if they don't direct it toward like a project or a greater work, they're just going to direct it toward people. And the problem is, when it's toward people, it tends to be a force of destruction. Like, if I find meaning in other people, either A, I'm going to be overtly attached to them, like the parent who's overly finds their identity in being a parent, so then when the kid goes to college, they have a breakdown. Or you're going to be over-invested in, like, people or friends always contacting you, and then when they don't contact you for 48 hours, you're angry at them and mad because you find... Or it can be like what you're saying, you find meaning by over-interpreting the time they forgot to get the mail, and that means they're forgetful, or that time where they didn't, you know, they forgot to make you breakfast or get your coffee, right? And so it's almost like when we talk about the meaning crisis, you know, when Vervaeke and them are discussing that, it's this idea that we can't find any sort of telos, any sort of greater purpose in life, and that's having mental health impacts on us. You know, there's some counters to it to say, well, we really shouldn't focus about having like an intellectual meaning. We should really focus on doing something. We should really focus on that. And also, as we talk about in Meaning as a Sign of Hope, the meaning crisis as a sign of hope, we have to understand that we do know how to find meaning as a society, say in fascism or racism or bigotry or, you know, closed-mindedness. The issue is today is that we're holding ourselves to a higher standard, like Thomas, some of the different saints or martyrs or different people like that. You know, like Sir Thomas More, you know, the Catholic saint who, you know, he could have easily at any point escaped imprisonment simply by accepting the divorce. And he didn't, so he's holding himself to a higher standard. So we have to, you know, in talking about the meaning crisis, we do have to complexify, to use that word philosophers always like to use, problematize it or whatever. But I think it is difficult. There is certainly truth to the idea of there being mental health problems, people not finding meaning, depression, so on, not having direction. You know, another idea of meaning is not having direction. And the problem is that it's like, it's almost like when we talk about the meaning crisis, people are still finding meaning. The problem, they're not finding meaning in the right way.
Exactly. And I think that's why I was like, well, maybe it could be interesting to think about this from a interpersonal relationship type of connection, because, you know, I think Adele said something like, Dr. Lass said something like, oh, you know, Hegel would just say, like, get over it, basically. Which true, it's true. But that, you know, it's there's something though that if we can say on an intellectual level that we don't really have to focus so much on a meaning crisis, okay? But people still live pretty miserably in their relationships sometimes because of these mismeanings, right? And that is where there is a real crisis, because the most tangible thing, the most tangible thing is like your daily lived experience, right? And that's where if you're going to feel some sort of weight of a crisis, or like a breakdown, or like a not functioning, it's in, you're going to find that in your, again, your relationship. So if you're dealing with unkindness, or whether you're receiving it or giving it, that's where it's very relatable to a crisis of meaning, because like you said, it's not so much about meaning itself, it's about what is it doing, and what is it, and I think that this is not to say that it's bad to find meaning in another person.
Sure.
The problem is when, like I said in the talk, like the problem is when you have these sort of superstructure meaning for them, this kind of singular idea of what that means that's immobile. If you have a lot of micro meanings where you find, okay, it could mean this, this, and this, but I'm not so sure, so I can't, why would I risk the relationship by kind of putting the gauntlet down on this is what it means that they did this, when I don't know, because there's various possibilities. There are a lot of micro meanings.
Right.
So I must leave myself open to what it could mean.
Yeah, well, you don't want to... So a few things.
Yeah.
One, there's a difference between the idea of a meaning crisis, meaning there is no meaning, and a meaning crisis, meaning we don't know how to direct meaning, or we don't know how to find a new source of meaning other than the previous sources, which were bigoted and immoral and problematic. So I do think we have to... I think a problem can be with the meaning crisis is it can be talked about in such a way as if there is no meaning. And that's kind of true. It depends on what you mean by that phrase. But no, there's plenty of meaning. And that's actually kind of the problem, because it's like people have an energy, like a power that they don't know, or they don't even know they're directing.
Yes.
And so they direct it into their relationships and find all these, what it means if this person hasn't called you, what it means if this person said this or that.
Yes.
And how they read into it and cause all these problems. Or, the other thing that can happen is people won't do something until they are sure it's meaningful, when in fact they may need to do it first to then find the meaning. So there's all these complexities that, sometimes, I think a critique of the meaning crisis is the idea that, like if you were mentioning Hegel, there'd be this kind of notion that getting over needing meaning will precisely have you act in such a way where you accept that negation.
Can you say that one more time?
Well, the very accept, like the idea when Hegel's like, get over not having meaning.
Yes.
Well, then the very act of accepting that and getting over it will then have you act in such a way based on that negation that will supplement to a meaning. And so, the getting over of meaning becomes the creating of a meaning, in so much though as then you don't consciously think about the meaning and thus stop acting and losing. So it becomes this very interesting, like it's kind of this circle that always has a gap, a lack in it, that if you just keep acting on though functions as a meaning, but only in so much as you don't stop and think about it as a meaning. So you have that complex action going on in the same way that like you prove freedom by using free will, but you can only understand freedom in terms of like causality. Yeah. You can't really observe freedom, and then we've got lots of papers on that. It's kind of a paradox that you have to do the thing in order to get the thing. So I understand the critiques against some of the understandings of meaning that would lead people to, say, sitting around all day wondering, trying to decide what they find meaningful before they act, and then therefore they never act.
Right.
At the same time, there's a ditch on either side of the road where you don't think at all and you just act, and then 40 years later you wonder what happened. So you have to have, quote unquote, a dialectic, our favorite word. But again, that is the critical epistemological method for really doing good thought and living a thoughtful life. But I think, so the meaning crisis is a matter of you're going to find meaning in things. And it's actually almost the irony of creating crisis of meanings in your relationship, because you create crises by seeing meaning that isn't there, or by overextending. The meaning of,
right. Because you're going to have meaning.
Yeah, there's
an overextension of that meaning.
Yeah, they went to the mailbox and they forgot the mail. The meaning of the act is that they forgot the mail. It's a closed loop.
Right, it's a closed loop. It's like, yes, it does mean something. It means they forgot the mail.
Yes.
Doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily mean they're irresponsible.
Yeah, or a bad person. Or a bad person. Like that. But there's something about us... Yeah. Well, there's something about us that
we
just
want
can't...
We want the bigger meaning. And so I think...
But without the work. We don't want to take sacrifice or risk. We want like a bigger meaning, a bigger thing, but not, actually, taking a risk. So then we project that onto people.
The risk, do you mean in like doing a bigger work or like doing?
Yeah, well, if you say, I'm going to write this project or I'm going to pursue this philosophy that know what other people value, you know, there's a risk in that, that you don't do something that can easily make you a job or that people think you're going to waste your time, so on and so forth. I mean, all pursuits of a intrinsic motivation entails a risk.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think too, just to say this as well, is that when it comes to the meaning crisis, obviously there's a direction of like, okay, life's meaningless and like, they're in a nihilistic sense, right? And perhaps, from a philosophical perspective, that is easily solved. But you have to. But there are many people. There are just many people who are dealing with that very problem.
Sure.
And maybe that seems like, okay, that's basic or that's simple, but everybody's at a different stage in life. Everybody's at a different stage in their journey and their development. And so to address that though is to. It's funny because it reminds me of the papers and the things we've done on boredom.
Yes.
Right, because it's like when somebody says like, well, I feel like life is meaningless. Okay, well, that is a definitional thing. That's still kind of a meaning you have given to life, even though it is, in your mind, it's a lot about the feeling, right? Like, it doesn't feel meaningful. Because the thing is, like, it's not as if there's no meanings. There's tons of meanings all around you, right? But it's that it doesn't feel meaningful to you. Right. And so there's something interesting about that because, again, it's not that there's no meanings. And you can, and you don't, it's all about how you are able to identify them, or also like allow them to be really just have an open hand to those different types of meanings because they're all around. But I think the idea of like how do you get to the place where you can feel the meaningfulness is interesting. I think, like you said, it's actually when you start to focus less on how. I don't know, how do I, it's so strange. It's almost like talking about it feels like I'm unraveling something or unscrambling something. But it's like you almost have to stop thinking about meaning, or not stop thinking about it, but stop focusing on, do I feel this is meaningful? And just start to really like actually do the thing as if you already think it's meaningful.
Well, a few things. One, I was going to say on the last point you were making that I think it is important when, say, someone forgets to get the mail, rather than like decide, well, that's because they're irresponsible and cling to it. What you're describing of, you think of like all the hundreds of reasons, or you say, well, there's hundreds of reasons why they may have forgotten the mail, the macro reasons, and therefore you deconstruct micro reasons, micro meanings. You then deconstruct your own certainty about why that thing occurred, so that you don't make a judgment. Yes. That would then you find meaning that would be very problematic. So I think that mental model, that epistemological move, is in fact helpful because it's true. You don't know why they forgot the mail. So, really considering all the reasons they may not have, to deconstruct your own certainty. We have this tendency to deconstruct other people, but not ourselves.
Yes.
Really, we should be in the business of primarily deconstructing ourselves, not others. But we usually get it back. Deconstruction should be in service of humility, but it's usually in service of increasing our own power. That's a misuse of deconstruction. That's not what Derrida intended, I don't believe, but that's what we've done with it. To what you're saying, we have the piece where you say, where it's like, if you can't figure out what the meaning of life is, ask what do you find beautiful. We try to link up beauty and value. You bring in boredom. One of the problems with the term meaning is it means so many things. There's definitional meaning. It's meaningful because it's valuable. There's meaning because it's significant. It's meaningful because it's worth doing. And part of the issue is when we talk about the meaning, it can say like teleological. Like, what do you think has a purpose, really? And honestly, what's going to get you out of bed in the morning is not an intellectual assent to a purpose.
It's coffee.
It's coffee. Well, now that is probably the logos, if I had to guess. But it's a feeling, or it's more of an emotional sort of thing. It's like it's driving you. It's not just an intellectual premise that, books on Hegel are needed, therefore I will do this book on Hegel. You can intellectually assent that there's a value here, but to actually get yourself to do it is a different matter. So, really, a lot of the problems of what causes, I think, the meaning crisis comes from a paralysis. Well, there's a lack of commitment. Like commitment, a real choice, something where you say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to fight for it. That's the big step that you've got to do.
And a lot of that is, it's really just a choice.
It is a choice. It is a choice, and it's a choice that may blow up in your face, and it could be real failure. We don't situate the meaning crisis enough. We don't hook up meaning enough with like a real choice. And by a real choice, it's a phrase used in that paper, Homo Iago, that's describing this idea that, when you're getting your face, I mentioned this in the recent talk with everyone for New Year's. You don't question if the world is real when you're getting your face plowed into the mat in a wrestling match. You don't question if the world is real when you're picking up square bales. There's a lot of people now talking about, is the world real? Is it really there? What does it even matter? Well, if you're in a really tough situation, the external world is real. You don't question if it's there. You feel it. Well, in the same way, if you make a choice to really commit to something and you're not backing down from it, you're in it. It feels real, and it's calling you, and you're now submitting yourself to it, because you're not going to find meaning in anything if you don't think anything is out there, and so the feeling of reality is critical for feeling as if there's something worth doing, because if nothing feels real, then there's nothing worth doing, and the only way to get the feeling, and I really emphasize the feeling of there being something other than you that is real, is to commit to that thing, to really commit to it, and to put it into a position where it demands something of you, because then it's real, because it's in the driver's seat.
And I wonder if, a lot of times maybe this more nihilistic, which Bard mentioned it being possibly where this nihilistic aspect of the meaning crisis, which maybe again could be fairly easily solved, if you will, or you can move on to kind of the next thing to grapple with. But the thing is that I think about it a lot of times. People, I think about, obviously this can happen at any stage of life, but I think about teenagers, young people who are just feeling kind of hopeless, kind of meaningless, what's the point? And I wonder if that has something to do with the fact that often young people are not necessarily always given the opportunity to make a choice. They go to, I just think about you go to school, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the point is that you don't necessarily have it's not necessarily your choice to do a lot of things. Now, maybe you choose to play the trombone, or maybe you choose to do wrestling or something like that. So obviously there's choice in that. But I guess it's the stakes being very real. I think that's the part of it where it's the choice, but then also the responsibility. And it's a very interesting thing that we don't always have. And maybe you could find some examples of where that is available to young people or teenagers. So I don't know. I could be. But
you said the key word just
stakes.
A moment ago. Stakes.
Yeah.
That was going to be.
I just think, I wonder if that actually causes a lot of the nihilistic direction of the meaning crisis.
What books are bad? Books are bad that don't have stakes. Stories don't work that don't have stakes. Really, if you think about the meaning crisis as the crisis of stakes, the steak crisis, if you will. I guess meat, we eat it with A1 sauce. No, but the steak crisis.
I just had this vision of books, you open it up and there's
meat.
There's a sirloin.
Yeah, it's the steak crisis and different things. So we'll say the steaks. We'll add an S to really bring. But really, if you think of it as the stakes crisis, the meaning crisis emerges in Freud and the discontent. Philip Reeve, all of them talk about this. If you are chopping wood every day and you're facing the elements, psychoanalysis emerges with first world, and Cadell mentions this with the Freud classes. Freud understood that the crisis, psychoanalysis was primarily needed in first world nations, because that's where all the existential and psychological trauma problems emerged. In third world nations, you're trying to survive. And so you're not worried about the psychological state. It you could say it's distracting you from yourself. Well, but it's distracting you from yourself, because there are but there's also, funny enough, they've done studies on this. Sometimes that a simple life that actually is just focused on survival can ultimately be happier. Now, does that mean we should all go back to that? Well, that might be running. That might be escapism. It depends. But the idea is that when life doesn't have stakes, then it loses meaning. In the same way, a book tends to be bad if it doesn't have stakes. But of course, what is a stake? It is the thing that you hammer into the ground. It is a stake. It's
that's
solid.
interesting.
And so to have stakes, there has to be something solid. But you exist in a world where you are always to be free. You know, you don't want to miss out on anything. You don't want to. You don't want to marry too early. You want to have experiences.
Right.
The whole emphasis of the culture is more and more freedom, more and more individual expression, more and more uniqueness. And all of that, and you don't want to have none of that, as belonging again is about, because then that's totalitarianism. But ultimately, you cannot solve the stakes crisis unless you put your stake down, unless you take a stand and take a giant risk. But of course, if you commit to something, but if you do that, that means you can fail. You cannot have meaning where you cannot fail.
Yes, and that's the thing. I think it's interesting because, it's interesting because the stakes of the simple life. Which also, what you just said, it reminded me a little bit of what Owen said in the end of the year talk with Cadell, Dr. Last and the others, where he was saying how, like, when he's for a week around, for some span of time, it's just around guys who just like to go chop wood and like just be on the farm. It almost like mellows him out a bit. Like he just kind of mellows his mood, and I think that's interesting. I wonder if we have almost like the stakes of that type of life, okay, if those have almost been like overlooked as oversimplified or as not real stakes. The real stakes would be over here, like in this funny kind of constructed little space of the things that are where, and the weird thing is like you can't ever really fail there, but you can in like in an existential way.
Yes.
But like if you fail, your stakes on the field is like, oh, you might cut off your hand.
Well, that gets
hopefully not. Sorry, that was kind of
no, exactly. But that's the case. You mess up a tractor, you could die. This gets into the status anxiety, social hierarchies, white collar, blue collar, all these different. And a lot of the meaning crisis emerges with mass technical society, where most jobs are at a computer. And you're sitting there, and you're in your head all the day. The meaning crisis, the stakes crisis, if you will, is partly, strongly, a consequence of a lack of embodiment, a feeling of not being embodied. Like, there's this weird phenomenon where a lot of these people who do computer work are also marathon runners. Like, they're so hungry, or they do a lot of extreme exercise. Like, and you could say that's a good thing. You can, but that just suggests that they're so hungry to feel embodied that then they want to do these kind of exercise. And arguably, that's a great thing. But it also could suggest that there's this split between their work life and their embodied life, which could potentially give rise to different neuroses. And other people, it seems to be extremely optimal. It depends. But the point is that there's this kind of splitting of the embodiment and the mind, and that also it also contributes to really trying to find a lot of meaning in career, that place where your mind is exercised. And there's some people that can do that, but the problem is the people who can get those jobs at the top of the white-collar hierarchy is very few. It does seem to work for the people who can get to the top of that hierarchy, but for an entire society, it may not be the best route to go. And that gets into where, I think what Deleuze prescribes as the line of flight, I think that can work for some individuals, but I'm not sure if that can work for a society. I'm not sure if you can have what in the paper Beauty Saves calls Deleuzian individuals. If you can have a society of Deleuzian individuals, I'm not sure if that's going to be a solution to the meaning crisis, even though it might be a solution to some given individuals. At this point, what you're getting into all of the society economic structures that are also contributing to this problem.
Sorry, when you're talking about Deleuzian, remember the reel we did this one reel on Instagram of a chicken, a large inflated
thing we ever did.
like a large inflated, not a real chicken, like a balloon chicken.
Yes.
And it was like the most popular.
It was the body without organs. Yeah, it was the body without organs. It was a giant.
That's
we
like
did
random
Unfortunate
Deleuzian.
Music.
Like
it's the most popular thing we ever did. We keep putting these posts with words.
And they're like, just bring back the inflated chicken. I want
these words. What are these words? This is Instagram. We want images. Insta. But anyway, so everyone go see our chicken. Stop the talk. Get away. Go find the reel. Your time will be used well. Your time will be used.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. But actually, I'm really glad you said about like this idea of the stakes crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Because see, that makes so much more, because the thing is, we only think about meaning in terms of good.
Yes.
What we should, like you're saying, what we should really see meaning is see meaning as is, wow, stakes.
It's stakes.
Because it's both good, it's like
it's both good and bad.
It's both good and bad. Or it's like
it's literary. It's tragic. It's ironic. It's a mixture. Yeah,
exactly.
it's difficult.
It's difficult.
It's not.
It's hard.
It's not
but
fluffy.
But it's also wonderful, right?
Yeah,
like it's.
I mean, people talk about meaning
So it's like
it's like you got your star power up in Mario and like you're now invincible or something. That's what they talk about.
Gosh.
But really, it's like
But
a great complex literary event.
Exactly, but because we don't hold space for that.
No.
Because we don't.
We're defining meaning in terms of consumerism, actually.
Yes.
It pleases us. It makes us feel nice.
Yes, and this is why I think we have the Meanie Crisis sometimes in relationships.
Absolutely.
Because we assume that our meaning of, they didn't go to the mailbox.
Yes.
So you keep that example. They've got the mail in the mailbox.
It must be right. It must be good.
That means that they're irresponsible.
Yes.
So we just see any meaning, even if it's not a negative meaning about somebody, we see that as good.
As adding to life. Yes.
Yeah, we see it as a value add that we did that.
Yes.
And, Dr. Cadell asked a good question about the topic of like, well, how do we hold space for, where is this place of like being able to acknowledge that we can all sometimes have those thoughts, and yet, honestly, you just often do have to let them go.
Yes.
But if there could be a place to sort of vent those, or what would be the right sort of way of letting those things go so that it doesn't just get held quietly and create any type of bitterness. I think it's there are lots of various ways to find a place for expression in a healthy way, probably that you do individually to grapple with it, and therefore you like actually release it, and it doesn't weigh on you. It doesn't like just kind of taint your mood and your how you treat others.
Well, I mean, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, if you think they go to the mailbox, they forgot the mail, therefore they're irresponsible, you have to carry out the practice of going, no, thinking of all the possible interpretations and who am I. There's an intellectual act you do on yourself where you realize that you don't know that. And if you just have the thought they're irresponsible and then just pretend like you didn't without carrying out the self-humbling act of realizing that you don't actually understand, or know, well then the thought just builds up. So there are certain self-disciplinary practices. Maybe they actually are though irresponsible. And so you take that thought, you see that, but you don't assume that. You gather more data from different things. You say, they're irresponsible, and then maybe it comes to a place where you need to confront them on it because they forgot to pay the heating bill, and now the house doesn't have electric. Now you're in trouble. So, but you don't jump from that based on a single instant. It has to be built up, but not in a manner that's making you get back or them. You really have to check your motives. Like, are you really trying to just make sure the bills get paid so everything held together? And you're also like, hey man, it seems like you sometimes forget. It's like, hey, you may not even want to say directly to them that you forget a lot of stuff. Then it gets into social graces and all the skills.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with like, okay, so you say you did really need the mail, and for some reason, you've just had like, I don't know, knee surgery, and you're on the sofa and you're like, can't move or something.
Yes.
And all you can do is simply say, hey, do you mind going to pick up the mail? You don't have to bring up like, why did you forget? Or, or ask a stupid false question. Like, did you forget the mail?
Yes.
Well, yes, no, it's not sitting on the counter. Of course they forgot it.
Yes.
So it's like, I think that it's okay to ask the person, so for example, if you're thinking, and I think it's a great question from Cadell, because, if you think about it, you can know in your head that, okay, I know that them not doing, let's just say it's a not doing X. Okay, they're not, I don't know, whatever. My go-to example is always, they're not making me coffee in the morning. Let's just say.
Sure.
Well, okay, just because they're not making you coffee in the morning doesn't mean that they don't, care, love you, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, you can know that, but you can still feel kind of like, it's like, I know I know I'm wrong about what I think.
Yes.
But I can still feel like, I just would really like to have like the person bring me coffee one morning, not like every day or something unreasonable, but or whatever it is. I guess it just kind of gets into assessing like, is there some sort of desire there that maybe you could actually solve it just by asking them, hey, would you like to get coffee with me this morning? Or hey, this Saturday I'd love to do coffee in the morning together. Like, you know what I mean? It's like you can, maybe that's another approach too, is just to realize, okay, holding those meanings, like holding them and then realizing, okay, instead of just throwing a macro structure on them about the meaning.
Well, that's where you're finding meaning without acting, and that's that other ditch on the other side of the road. You know, in that circumstance, like you say, you have to act and ask for the coffee in the morning, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. The problem becomes like situation where you sit there and you're like, well, they should just know that I want coffee in the morning, and if they don't just know that, what does that mean? Oh, it must mean they don't care about me, so on, and you create this whole story. And yeah, I mean, like, those giant narratives that people make in relationships about little actions are these kind of macro meanings. They're like these giant. So it's just very important to stop thinking about meaning as necessarily good. You know, meaning can be very bad. It has to be situated within a more comprehensive understanding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think that the idea, I mean, I think largely it is a kind of just realizing that the letting go and the deconstructing, right, of like, okay, I have this idea. I mean, it's like you initially as a human might have some sort of macro meaning. You're like, oh, they didn't, they should know this or not. But I think the more you practice saying, okay, that's probably wrong, the more it can become, the reaction then is just really to assess, really like just to say, okay, that they did X or they didn't do X. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean anything. I think to me, it was, I think in realizing this more and more, it's very freeing.
Oh, sure.
Because you're like, oh, right. It doesn't have to mean like something giant.
It doesn't have to mean anything beyond itself.
Right, beyond itself. Like it has the meaning of itself, but it doesn't have to mean something more than that. And just to kind of realize like, it's interesting because these macro meanings, it just makes things very weighty, and then it's like every single thing you do or don't do could like mean some giant thing about you or how much you care or don't care, and it's very, then you kind of feel like, oh my gosh, like how can I ever prove that I can, whatever, it just gets into very I don't know, you can get very into a place of being very paranoid about like your actions or and I mean, yes, our actions matter, but like you can't, in this idea of macro meanings, you're not. It's when people do this to one another, they end up, I think, being exhausted because they're always like feeling they have to prove themselves to one another.
Well, I mean, you said another great word, matter. Like we assume that if it's meaningful, it matters. But it's possible that a lot of like all these drama situations where you're finding meanings that don't matter.
Exactly. Right. It's like some meanings don't matter.
Yeah, or they don't correspond to reality.
Exactly.
They don't have any matter. They don't have any materiality.
Exactly.
They don't have any matter. So it's erroneous to assume that meaning and matter go together.
Right.
Even though I know what people mean. I mean, again, if we take this idea that you always have meaning, so in a sense there is no meaning crisis. If we define the meaning crisis as the loss of meaning, there's a sense in which that is incorrect, because there always is meaning. And in fact, we do know how to solve the meaning crisis by going back to fascism. We've said it before, as discussed in the meaning crisis as a sign of hope. So it's not that meaning is not there. The problem is that meaning is not properly directed. It's like energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Likewise, meaning cannot be created nor destroyed. It's always there. If humans are operating, they're finding meaning. The issue is that when it is not directed towards something you commit yourself toward, like we were talking earlier, like a real choice, then it's almost like meaning is unbound. It's almost what you have to do is you have to commit to something to bind meaning and to also focus meaning. And if you don't do that, your problem is like that you find meaning everywhere, exactly what you're saying. Like in your relationships, everything means something, and so it's chaotic. It's almost like this difference between if you don't have a focus meaning that is bound by a commitment to something you're going to give yourself to, whether it be a charity organization, your work, whatever your work is, your relationship, that you commit to, that you really commit to, and that you can fail at, well, then it's unbound, and then it's unfocused. And then it's like a machine gun almost, just kind of going everywhere. And so I think it is very important to understand meaning is neither created nor destroyed. It is always going on, and that if it's not focused and bound by that focus, by a real choice and commitment, it can be the source of endless strife and drama in people's relationships.
But wouldn't somebody be like, well, I did make a commitment. I'm like, let's just say it's in married couples, because so you might see this problem maybe more predominantly since
Sure.
they spend day in, day out with
Sure.
one another. But it's kind of like, when they're like, well, I've committed to, my husband or to my wife. And
Oh, sure. Oh,
so
sure.
I don't, like, I'm trying to do my best to contain and bind my meaning.
The issue there, though, is the problem of making a person a project. There's a difference between committing yourself toward the person as opposed to making them a project to make them right. Because when you're, say, finding, for example, the fact that they didn't get you coffee means that they're not thinking about you, means there's something to fix. There's something to change. That would get into the subject of the difference between committing to a work that's not trying to change a living being, that puts on the difference between a work that puts all the demands on yourself and a work that puts the demands on other people.
Well, right. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like Rilke, where he talks about like, something that will make for a successful relationship. In the end, he didn't use these terms, but is like to be basically be, I think he did use the term committed to each other's solitude, basically.
Yeah.
You watch over each other's solitude.
Yes.
So basically, like, I think what's interesting is, like, actually you have to commit. It's funny, like, to be in a committed relationship, let's just say a marriage, okay, is, yes, you make a commitment to that person, but it's almost like you also make a commitment to your orientation, to you, and toward that other person. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You have to commit to, it's just as much like, I think you get the commitment, and that, obviously, like, okay, you exchange vows, that's your commitment, you promise, you make that promise, but the promise is actually to an attitude. Like, it's almost like the way it's going to actually work the best, and where you won't have Meanie crises all the time with each other, is like when you commit to I think that openness, that deconstruction of your own mind. So it's weird. It's like you're committing to the other person, but you're also making a commitment in yourself to have a certain outlook.
Well,
in
a sense, you're committing to another person as an opportunity for you to do better. You're committing to another person to put the onus on you, not on them.
But I think that we lose sight of that. Like, we think about it, and this is where the people projects happen, where, it's like, it's almost like you're, I don't know, I just had the image, it's like you cast out your line, you gotta, like, you hooked onto somebody, and you're just sort of like, that's kind of what's, you're trying to just,
Well, and the key idea when we're talking
versus it being like, I commit to that person, but I actually now I work on myself.
Well, because, when we're talking about the idea of the world feels real because there's something external to you that you've submitted yourself to. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to change a person, you haven't submitted yourself to that person. You're changing them. You are still in control. Like, there's something about when you commit to something, then there's a self-sacrifice. There's a giving yourself over to that.
Yeah.
Which, if you're always finding problems with them, or finding meanings in their actions, then you really haven't made a real choice for that thing. You have not submitted yourself toward that thing. You are still submitting it to you, as opposed to you submitting yourself to it.
Yes.
Now, in a relationship, the idea is that both parties simultaneously submit to the other, so that they catch each other, right? Yeah. And usually what ends up happening is somebody sees quote-unquote red flags where they feel like the other person isn't doing that. But you see, the issue becomes like, is it the case that the person isn't doing that if they didn't clean the kitchen? People start picking little examples of what means they're not doing that. They're not doing their side of the bargain. And they decide that not cleaning the kitchen equals not doing that, right? Yeah. Well, the problem is there's 1,000 reasons why someone doesn't clean the kitchen. And does not cleaning the kitchen really mean that? Does it really at the end of the day mean that they're not, say, making their focus you as you make their focus them? And the moment you do that, it breaks. Like the whole not looking at yourself but looking at the other relationship breaks the moment you start conditioning it.
Yeah.
And seeing evidence that it's not being done. Like, basically, if we're using the marriage example, you just have to assume you with the vow you trust that's the case, and you don't look for evidence showing it's not, unless it becomes obvious. You can always make the extreme explicit example, like they're cheating on you, right? Or there's physical. We can always do that.
Yes, and obviously those things wouldn't want to be overlooked.
No, not at all. But when we're talking about the things that fall within the hermeneutically negotiable, the unclear, the ambiguous, if you don't have a meaning that is focused or directed on something bigger, you're going to turn people into projects, and that's where it becomes a Meanie Crisis.
Exactly. And I do think, I mean, this what we're talking about, to me, I guess the reason why it came to my mind is because you do see this happen a lot.
Yes.
It's like if people just are constantly kind of just saying, oh, well, this means this.
Yes.
That, the person did this means that.
Oh, yes.
And I think there's almost a feeling of like, well, how couldn't it mean that? Like,
oh, yes, of course.
Well, of course it means that. And, if you don't see it or if they don't see it, like, what's wrong with you, and like, right. And also too, the person probably feels that way because they love and care. They probably are, oftentimes people see these things because they want to make sure everybody's happy. Like, let's say it's people who care about each other and love each other. Okay, so they want the people to be happy. So then they might say like, well, because that's happened, it means this. And I think a lot of it is just, it's interesting because often these Meanie crises aren't because people just like hate each other. It's because they love each other. And because of that, and I mean, I do advise people to love one another, but
just in case it wasn't clear.
Right? But, it's like the way though that I think we're ultimately going to extend a love that is not suffocating, but like truly thriving, like allows everyone to thrive in related to it, then you have to kind of let go of like what things could mean, because also it's like, does it really solve anything? Does it really?
Sure.
I mean, it's like, okay, even if you're right, did it work very well to frame it that way, to talk to the person that way? Like, did you succeed?
Well,
or did you just make them feel bad? And now they just kind of always feel like they have to prove that thing to you.
No,
it's
a in that situation, the introduction of meaning becomes the loss of, the relationship.
Yeah.
I think another way to look at it is that kind of what you're describing is almost like personal fundamentalism. Where like the fundamentalists,
that's
like,
exactly the terminology I was thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh yeah, I was thinking religious fundamentalism. Yeah. Personal fundamental. In the same way, it's like well, clearly if it's in a Christian context, well, clearly the Bible means this, and if you don't think the Bible means this, how could you not think that it means this? Mm-hmm. And the reason they want you to read the Bible correctly is to save your soul. Is because they care about you.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of the fundamentalist.
Oh, I see.
It's kind of like the fundamentalist bent, where you're just applying that in regard to personal and social relationships.
And see, the thing is that if you, unto yourself, or like if I think it's interesting because actually it is in marriages or like partnerships of like of long term or committed long term relationships, where you're going to see a lot of this come out a lot more, because not only are the two people who are from two different family cultures, etc., coming together, but then their families are coming together, right. And there's a whole lot of new, I guess what I mean to say is like, it's almost like micro pluralism, like, it's like you're like, oh, what seemed very obvious to me and all my siblings or all my cousins or whatever, like is like, oh, their family has like a whole different way of viewing this X thing or reacting or viewing how they react, whatever. So it's just very interesting, and it's like, it's good though, because in a way it does teach us to be like, I think when you encounter that, you start to realize, oh wow, like people are different.
Well, and if you don't
so to be able to be like, I think if we can try to at least like humble ourselves, realize that like, oh wow, okay, people really are different. They have different perspectives on things. They have different interpretations of things. I might be wrong or right. I don't know. I'm not certain. So then I think that's the best that we've got, like to be able to have that humble position. So go ahead.
No, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you don't have any focused meaning per se, stakes, use that language again, then when the family cultures come together, there's really no way to focus the meaning. It just goes everywhere and everything, and then you have a lot of Meanie crisis. So, I mean, basically, if you don't, the meaning crisis is generally a stakes crisis, where people don't have stakes. Their life is not, in a sense, literary. It's erroneous And problematically, we tend to think that meaning is good. If meaning is present, it is good. But really, a lot of the problems you have been describing are a meaning crisis. It's a using of meaning in a way that causes crisis. And the crisis is, the Meanie Crisis. So, the stakes, the introduction of stakes, which is a result of taking a real commitment, a real choice, and really standing for it and going and thus having a literary flavoring to one's life, is critical for avoiding the Meanie Crisis, which we seem to naturally fall into because meaning is neither created nor destroyed, only directed. And so if we don't direct it, then it tends to vent in the form of these endless instances of being mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, anyway, for more by OJ Rose, please visit ojrose.com, YouTube, Instagram, and thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much.